It wasn't until I started wearing the hijab that I started experiencing racist comments where you'd be at your local shopping centre and somebody would call you towelhead. At the University of Western Australia, I had a fellow classmate put his hand up and ask, "Do you have a bomb under that thing on your head?" That othering was not unique. Obviously, when the Taliban came in power in Afghanistan, it was really difficult when my family had to uproot and move to Peshawar in Pakistan.
Do you feel being used by the Labour Party?
When I was elected in 2022, it was a shock to everybody, but they celebrated it because they knew that having the first hijab-wearing senator who's young, who's female, who's a person of faith, ticks all their boxes. People would call me a sellout. People would question my faith and say, are you even a Muslim? There were moments where I had been hospitalized for severe migraines. I was put on blood pressure medication. And the fact that it took them 12 months to even use the C word, which is condemn Israel, you would think that seeing the annihilation of a population, seeing little children's limbs blown off, that they would care enough. The Labour Party were not brave enough and courageous enough to call a spade, to call it a genocide.
So do you really think it's some lobby?
There's the Zionist lobby that's got international influence, very powerful, very organized. What's happening is a genocide and it needs to be condemned, it needs to be called out, and our government's complicit by not doing enough. When Zombie Franken was killed, and I thought this could be the turning point for Australian government to say, "Hey, Israel, you've killed one of our citizens."
Is it fair to the Labour Party that you become a senator based on their following, and after that you part ways with them and launch your own party?
Australia's voice came into conception after many conversations that I had with Australians where they were constantly saying, "We feel that we don't have a voice. We don't have an avenue to have our voices heard."
Welcome, Senator Fatima Payman. Thank you so much for joining our podcast. So before we jump into some serious questions about Australia, I would like to know a bit about your childhood and when you came here as a migrant. Like, what was that experience? How did you feel about it?
Thank you for the question. I was 8 years old when I came to Australia. My dad had arrived by boat in 1999 and rocked up the shores of WA, spent a few months in a refugee camp or detention centre. And then after working around the clock for the next 3 years, was able to sponsor me, my mum and my two younger siblings. Adjusting into the Australian way of life was something quite unique. Obviously, I had spent my formative years in Pakistan, so trying to retain my Afghan culture, my faith as a Muslim, but also this new identity as an Australian was quite a maze to, traverse through and really understand. I was lucky to go to Australian Islamic College in my primary years and into high school to really embed what my identity is and how you navigate that space. I felt like any other ordinary Australian. It wasn't until I started wearing the hijab at the age of 11 that I started experiencing racist comments, discrimination on a very local level, where you'd be at your local shopping centre and somebody would call you towelhead, or someone would yell, "Go back to where you came from." And when you're so young, it doesn't really, you question why people are treating you differently, why you feel alienated. And it wasn't until I went into university and realized that, this can be quite systemic, and mainstream media and the propaganda out there really impact people's perspectives on seeing somebody who's visibly Muslim or visibly different in terms of attire. I've shared this story so many times in my first ever tutorial at the University of Western Australia when I got up to introduce myself as a student of biomedical science. I had a fellow classmate put his hand up and ask, "Do you have a bomb under that thing on your head?" Not even didn't refer to it as a scarf or the veil. And that othering was not unique. But I just didn't expect it to take place at university, like it's an institution where you're seeking knowledge, where, bright people come together to really forge new perspectives, keep an open mind. But to be othered in that context, I obviously gave him the benefit of the doubt. And my snappy remark was, "Well, if I did, you wouldn't be alive."
Okay. And do you think there was a huge difference in culture when you were studying in Australian Islamic College, interacting with all Muslims for 10 years, 11 years, and suddenly going to university and it's a new world out there? So what was that like?
I was very blessed to be in the student council, and we had many interfaith excursions where we engaged with students from all backgrounds, all faiths. I remember going to Carmel Jewish School and engaging with the students there, sharing our beliefs, ideas, and it really opened my mind and perspective to, wow, there's more to Australia, there's more to WA than just the little bubble that is Australian Islamic College. And so I treasured those opportunities of being in the student council and then becoming head girl at Australian Islamic College in Kudal, and understanding the political system, visiting Parliament House as a school group and engaging with politicians, talking to them. So transitioning to university wasn't that big of a deal for me personally, but I can't say the same to my other peers. Some of them found it very difficult to adjust to, the outside world, as they would put it. It was a new way of life. Not only did you have so much autonomy and agency as an individual going into university, but there was a breadth of different people of all walks of life that you had to work in group settings, in teamwork, in various tutorials, whether you were involved in university clubs. And I was very fortunate to get involved in the Muslim Student Association at UWA, and later on became the president, which was another eye-opening experience, again, with its own challenges. But that allowed me to transition into university and make use of the uni mentor system. And soon after my first year, I became a uni mentor to mentor other students and allow them to have a smoother transition, because I was the first one in my family to come to university in a Western context or within Australian system, and it was a huge shift. I didn't have anyone older than me to, help me navigate that system. So really heavily relied on the mentors that the university provided, which was great help, and soon I was able to give that help back.
And who do you think is responsible for the struggle that your father went through? I mean, why was he forced to leave Afghanistan? Why did he adopt this path of being a refugee? And what were the circumstances? And who do you think is responsible for that?
Yeah, so obviously when the Taliban came in power sort of around the 1996, 1997 era in Afghanistan, it was really difficult when my family had to uproot and move to Peshawar in Pakistan and start from scratch. My mum was pregnant on my second sibling, and she told my dad, "You've got to find another haven. You've got to find somewhere where our children have a better future, a better shot in life. And this isn't where we see our children." So for my mum to give my dad that final push, she always recalls the conversation he had when Dad had found his way to Indonesia, and he calls my mum 2 days before he jumps on a boat and says, "We've just received news that the boat that just left before us, it got destroyed in the storms and everyone died on the boat." And my mum, to be pregnant, to know the risks and how much of a big sacrifice this is on my dad's part, still encouraged him and said, "I have made istikhara, which is the prayer of guidance. And so I have full faith that, you're going to have a safe journey. So don't feel like you're being distracted, or don't allow fear to get to you. Just have faith and continue embarking on this journey." And subhanAllah, just even thinking about it, sometimes it gives me goosebumps. Had my dad ever thought that the 11 nights and 11 days on a small boat traversing the Indian Ocean to a land that's so foreign and unknown to him, but one day his daughter would become a senator of that same state, it just blows my mind. So it was difficult. My dad really risked so much for us to be here, and losing him in 2018 when he got acute myeloid leukemia, it was one of the biggest turning points in my life, where I realized that him passing away at the age of 47 means that I probably, who knows, like there is no guarantee when it comes to life and our futures. So I need to make the most of every moment that I have now.
And do you think it is a similar situation in Palestine right now, that the people there, the families out there, they are seeking a way out, and whoever gets an opportunity would flee to some Western country which is more peaceful and stable? But at the same time, the unrest is created by all these countries, including Australia. So what are your thoughts on that? I mean, is that a conflict that we experience as Muslims, or how do you see that?
I see what's happening in Palestine as, firstly, something that's historic, and obviously the illegal occupation that they've had to endure. Human rights organizations have called Gaza an open-air prison. The siege that they've had to be under, that can't be anything that anyone else can relate to in particular. So as Afghans, as much as there are atrocities and injustices taking place in Afghanistan, the massacring that we're seeing, and that we have been seeing in particular in the last 12 months, has been beyond our comprehension. And that's what's really united every human being with a conscience around the world. They don't have to necessarily be Muslim. They don't necessarily have to be from Afghanistan or from any country that's endured injustice. I think innately as human beings, we realize that when there is an injustice happening, it is our responsibility and duty to call it out. And seeing our governments fail to do that has enraged each and every person with a conscience out there. And I tried within closed doors, having backroom conversations, talking to the ministers while I was part of the Labor Party, and realized that every effort just went out in vain. There was no traction. There was no political will.
And why do you think is that? Like, I mean, are they not able to see children dying? Are they not able to see family suffering? Like, why are they not able to acknowledge it?
You would think that seeing the annihilation of a population, seeing little children's limbs blown off, that they would care enough, that there would be the care factor to at least influence their foreign policy. But we've clearly seen that in opposition, the Labor Party were very vocal. I recruited people from Palestinian backgrounds to speak at our state and national conferences to talk about how should the Labor Party get into government and win power, that we would implement these changes. So it was in our party platform, but to then come into government and have that power to implement those changes and choose not to. Yes, it talks towards the invisible hand that I keep hearing about. And that invisible hand could be in terms of how organized the Zionist lobby is. And they've got international influence. I kept on hearing that Australia is a small fish in a big pond, but we are a sovereign nation which should exercise its sovereignty, which should have its own national foreign policy that's in the best interest of Australians, not in the best interest of the US, not in the best interest of the state of Israel. And the whole idea of we want a two-state solution, but one of those two states you don't even recognize, was not rocket science. It was a no-brainer. They should have really assessed their options and not just, have little crumbs to give to the Palestinian Muslim community here in Australia, that we're in absolute shock and pain. The horrors that they were seeing live streamed, the destruction, the devastation. And some of the stories I heard from people firsthand is they would be contacting their local Labor MPs, and those MPs would not get back to these constituents. And so these constituents would meet the MPs during their mobile offices out in the park. And the first question when these constituents go up to the MP and say, hey, I've lost 20 members of my family who were obliterated by an Israeli missile. And the first thing that comes out of these Labor MPs' lips are, do you live in my constituency? Do you live in my electorate? Now that's outrageous. The fact that, where is your humanity? If somebody had come up to you and said, my dog just got killed or my dog just died, you would stop and not even think and say, I am so sorry for your loss. That's common decency. But the fact that these lines that the Labor Party keep parroting, and they expected me to parrot, they have it ingrained to the extent where they've lost their humanity. They've lost that sense of being a human being and saying, I'm sorry that you've lost 20 members of your family. I'm sorry that our government's not doing enough, but I see you and I hear you. That doesn't take a lot of effort. And I mean, when I did that to the students who were camping outside on Curtin University grounds, I get tracked and monitored closely by my senior Labor colleagues, who then pick up the phone and say, what were you doing there? Did you get clearance? Did you talk to the foreign minister? Did you get lines of what to say, what not to say? How did the students react? It was like, do I have a tracker on my back? It's bizarre that as an elected official, as a senator for Western Australia, I was micromanaged to that extent on a foreign policy matter that was causing more detrimental impacts in our streets than it was doing anything positive. Because even with the distribution of the $25 million that was to silence people, we were constantly hearing about social cohesion. Yes, social cohesion is very important, but there are ways of ensuring that that social cohesion comes with listening to your constituents, that comes with understanding their pain, that's giving them a safe space to feel heard, not isolating them, not silencing them, not marginalizing them, because it just turned out to not work for the Labor Party at all. And people have been leaving and resigning from the party in droves, and that's their own doing.
Do you feel being used by the Labor Party for their own agenda and optics, and to sort of give a perception of inclusivity that Muslims are with us? Do you feel you were used by them?
When I was pre-selected as number 3 on the Senate ticket, I was told you're not going to win the seat. And I was like, okay, I mean, I'm only 27. I don't have much experience. This would give me that good on-the-ground campaigning vibe, and I'll really understand what it means to be a candidate. And so when I was elected in 2022, it was a shock to everybody, including myself, but also to the party. They were not expecting it, but they celebrated it because they knew that having the first hijab-wearing senator who's young, who's female, who's a person of faith, who's a person of color, from a refugee background, ticks all their boxes. And of course, they were going to parade it and use that as an opportunity to showcase to the world what it meant to have somebody of a diverse background elected. Now, I'm not saying that I was the only diversity token. I mean, we've got other people like Sam Lim elected, Zanita Mascarenhas, and they are great, candidates in their own rights and on their own merit. But with me being there and being sent on 5 international delegations over the last 2 years that I was elected, a backbench senator sent to places like Indonesia, Malaysia, Bahrain. I didn't even know Bahrain existed. It was amazing. South Korea and Rwanda. It was wonderful. It was eye-opening, but the expression on people's faces was worthy of taking photos because they were absolutely shocked to hear that I'm not part of the delegation in a capacity of being a secretary. I'm there as a senator, an elected official. But where I felt like I was being used as damage control in the last 12 months was when there would be a screw up that, somebody in an electorate office, even on a state level, would accidentally send a grieving Palestinian family a pro-Israeli standard response. Somebody's written to their local Labor MP saying, hey, I've lost 30 members of my family and we're grieving, we are devastated, what is you and your government doing? And instead of actually responding from a place of humanity and just empathizing, they would receive a standard pro-Israeli response. Israel has the right to defend itself. 30 members of my family were just killed. Like, how? And to not be told that, hey, Fatima, you are coming to my office to meet this constituent who's a big fan of you, who wants to raise concerns, but not being told that this is to cover up a mistake that one of their staffers made, I felt was quite disingenuous. And to hear it from the constituent who basically was like, I was outraged to receive this pro-Israeli standard response. And I had to then try to do the patchwork and say, I'm sorry that this happened. Errors and mistakes happen, and that staffer has been reprimanded and spoken to and cancelled. This will not happen ever again, but we are listening. Your voice matters. We are doing what we can.
But you are not sure about that it would not happen again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I had no guarantee. I didn't even have any guarantee that the federal government would change its stance, but I lived with that hope. I thought maybe one day. And so I think the straw that broke the camel's back was when Zomi Franken was killed. And I thought, as awful as it sounds, this could be the turning point for our position, our official position as the Australian government to say, hey, hold on. Yes, Israel, you may be our friend, but we're going to draw a line here. You've killed one of our citizens who you're supposed to protect under the Geneva Convention, under international humanitarian law, but you've breached that. So until the investigation's concluded and there is a transparent outcome that gives closure to us as Australians, we will suspend all arms deals and trade deals. We will pause it. Just like how we paused the UNRWA funding, we can pause this. But no.
That did not happen.
They did not do that. I remember calling the foreign minister and saying, let's do it. I'm okay to be reprimanded on national TV. I will say that the government should do this. And you can then come out and say, no, Senator Payman said something in a moment of, being absolutely under pressure or being very emotional. This isn't the government's position. At least the community, at least the broader Australian public will understand that there is some movement, there is some traction happening from within the Labor Party. But the response I got from the Foreign Minister was, you can't put me and the Prime Minister in an awkward position. So they were more worried about the optics than actually doing something tangible to maintain the peace on our streets.
So do you really think it's some lobby or some hidden hand that is influencing them, or is it a matter of clash of civilizations or something that they truly believe in, but they cannot say it out openly, but they are acting according to it. So, how do you see it?
I think there is a bit of many factors, right, that are influencing this. Yes, there's the Zionist lobby that's got international influence, very powerful, very organized. Then we've got peak bodies like ECAJ. Then there is also the Australian Jewish Association.
Yeah.
All these peak bodies that know how to campaign, that know how to get their message across, that have media trained all their representatives and spokespeople, and they're consistent with the same messaging. That same level of organization does not exist within the pro-Palestinian, pro-humanity cohort, where they're like, what's happening is a genocide and it needs to be condemned, it needs to be called out, and our government's complicit by not doing enough. That level of organization does not exist in that second group, and that's something we need to work on. We also have the Murdoch media that is against the pro-Palestinian community and the pro-Palestinian cause, which means that the Labor Party found themselves stuck between peak bodies that are powerful and organised and also the Murdoch media, which is powerful and organised, because the coalition, the Liberals and Nationals, would obviously do what's in the best interest of those massive lobby groups. And it felt like, or at least the Labor Party were not brave enough and courageous enough to call a spade, to call it a genocide, to, be tactful around how they went with the messaging. They lit all our monuments around the country in white and blue, but they couldn't do that with a Palestinian flag. Even though there was no proportionality in the death count.
Yeah.
Even the messaging, even the way it was described, it was 20,000 Palestinians died. Died by what? An earthquake? A natural disaster? No, they were killed. So call it for what it is. And the fact that it took them 12 months to even use the C word, which is condemn Israel, just indicates that they thought when 7th of October happened that this would all subside and go away in a few weeks' time. They didn't know that this was going to be an ongoing thing for more than a year. And their initial response sort of dictated the trajectory they were on. It almost felt like they were too scared to backpedal and say, okay, we condemn the atrocities against the Israeli people on 7th of October, but we also equally need to condemn the atrocities and the massacring of Palestinians, right? But they just couldn't see that, and they were just too scared. And like Gough Whitlam said, some people are so afraid to put a foot wrong that they will not put a foot forward. And it felt like the Labor Party was just stagnant, And when I was in there, they would say, well, at least we're not the Liberals and Nationals. And it's like, that's a very low bar. If you're comparing yourself to them, who basically ruined so many systems in the last 9 years that they were in government, then you're setting yourself up to fail, because the Australian people want a brave, courageous government who are not afraid of doing what is necessary.
So just for the clarity of mainstream Australians, what does Palestine mean to you as a Muslim? And why is it so important for every Muslim to protect that Masjid al-Aqsa and Baitul Maqdis? What is the significance of that?
It's significant to us as Muslims, and I want to break the standard lines that this is only a Muslim issue or only Muslims must care for this, because we've seen people from all walks of life come on, including people from the Jewish faith, saying this injustice needs to be called out. I see what's happening in Palestine as, firstly, a grave injustice. It's an illegal occupation, the constant oppression that's been ongoing for decades, 76 plus years, and the violence that perpetuates. And now that we've heard the ICJ say that there is a case of apartheid, a systemic apartheid that's been ongoing. For us to turn a blind eye reflects on our guilt. And when I say our guilt as the Australian population, because the genocides that were taking place against the Indigenous people of this land, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, is something that's still lingering, and we have not reconciled. We have not reached reconciliation with that. And yes, we have Reconciliation Week, and yes, we've got the National Apology Day, and we say sorry. What are we doing to rectify that mistake? What are we doing to move forward towards a better, cohesive future? And by Australia not being forthright and calling it out indicates that we still have that settler colonial mentality and guilt that holds us back from calling out another colonizer, which is Israel, to say, you are colonizing, you are kicking people outside of their home. There was a massive exodus, and you just want Palestinians to be kicked out of their homelands. The fact that they are refusing to acknowledge them as the Indigenous people of those lands indicates that there is no such thing as a two-state solution in the Israeli people or in the Israeli government's mind. They don't want that. And so for the whole world to try to say we want a two-state or a one-state solution, that's not for us to decide. That is up for the Palestinians once the oppression has ended, once the violence has ended, once the occupation has ended, to then sit at a table with the Israelis as equals and negotiate, all right, what do we see as a viable solution for us?
Okay, coming back to, this was an intense conversation. So
it always is.
I went through a lot of speeches that you did in the parliament and also some of the interviews that you did with other people. So I see that you have a lot of respect and love for your father and maybe more or equal for your mother. Let's talk about your mother a bit. Like, where do you see her? What role did she play after your father's death or before that? And how is she? Because I see a lot of strength in you. I see a lot of faith in you. I see a lot of voice in you. So how much of a contribution is from your mother? And talk about her a bit.
My mother has been my role model and my best friend growing up. I look up to her tenacity and her vision, but also the fact that she is such a go-getter. You know, she sets her mind to something and she will execute and she will just do it. Whereas my father, Allah yarhamu, may God have mercy on him, he was a planner. He would have his Excel spreadsheets. He would think about all sorts of scenarios before executing and before, giving something a go and making a decision. So I feel like I have my mother's decisiveness, but to a certain extent, I also have my dad's wisdom in terms of really planning and putting forethought and consulting. In terms of my mum's bravery and courage, she, growing up back in Mazar Sharif, she was part of the Girl Scout. She was a leader within her own rights. And I see that in myself at times. There are moments where she is afraid of my line of work, as any mother would. It's a male-dominated space. It requires me to travel quite a lot. So we do have conversations where I'm trying to reassure her, and sometimes I don't share the nasty sides of, the world of politics, just so that she's not overwhelmed, because it's a lot when you're a single parent, you've lost your husband, and you've got 4 children to look after. No matter how old we become, we're still little children in my mother's eyes. So knowing that she always has my back, whether, she understands the political world or not. My dad was quite political.
Your grandfather was also a member
in
of
politics,
parliament.
And my dad had visions of starting his own party. So even when he had immigrated to Australia, every conversation we would have at the dinner table involved a discussion around how one day he would take me back to Afghanistan and perhaps establish a political party and get me to run as a candidate. My dad never saw me any less than a son. Like I was his eldest child. He treated me as an equal to a son, and sometimes would praise me and say, "You're better than 10 sons put together." So for me, that meant that I had that self-assurance and confidence to just put my mind to whatever. And I know that to a certain extent, Dad's ability to pacify a situation and just be so calm and collected is something I aspire towards. In this line of work, some people make very rash decisions. They operate out of emotion. They can't objectively look at a situation. So I have been working very hard on myself to make sure that I do have a pacifist mindset where I'm trying to, find a solution, find a way out that is going to be in the best interest of the collective. And where I must stand my ground, then do it with conviction. And that's where I always remember my dad saying, live life with a clear conscience and you have no one to fear. And whether it's your own self that you have to make a decision against because it's the right thing to do, it's not always the easiest, but,
And are your brothers and sisters proud of you?
Yeah, I think they see me as the outlier. My sister always comments on how calm I am in front of, media and cameras. And my brothers, they're in their own world. So I think I feel like an outlier because my sister's a pharmacist. My brother is a civil engineer. And the younger one is studying mining engineering. So they're very technical in their way of thinking, very scientific. And I turn out to be the outlier.
In terms of being calm and composed on media and in front, like in public appearances, but in personal life, I imagine you would have gone through a lot of stress and emotions and inner conflict when this entire episode was happening. So how did you cope up with that, and what was the role of your partner in reassuring whatever decisions you were making? So talk a bit about that. How much of an emotional support did you had because I could imagine it would have been a very intense situation and it would have effect on your emotions and mental health.
It was one of the most difficult periods of my life. But the fact that my husband would always remind me that Allah never burdens a soul more than it can bear. It just gave me the reassurance that I've got it in me to keep persevering. When you have your family being impacted, my little cousins who share the same surname were being bullied on social media. My husband, being a senior advisor to a senior state minister, had the potential of losing his job. My family were constantly on edge, not knowing about my safety and how things were going to end up.
Did you have difference of opinion with your husband on the job?
So initially, mind you, we only got married in February of this year and all this unraveled May onwards. But during those few months after we got married, there were moments where I had been hospitalized for severe migraines. I was put on blood pressure medication because, again, as you can imagine, the human and politician inside me were at constant war. And it felt like an uphill battle. But initially, we both had the understanding that it's better for me to be within the Labor Party to enact change and to push for change to take place. And in that duration, it was having those background backroom conversations and as many people I could speak to. I was just constantly seeking advice, thinking, am I the only one? Almost, gaslighting myself and thinking, why am I so worried about this and everyone else seems to be okay with parroting the same standard lines? Why me? Why was it just not sitting well with me? And so my husband had publicly defended me on X and on other social media platforms where people would call me a sellout. People would question my faith and say, are you even a Muslim to not see the atrocities take place and you're silent, or call me complicit in the genocide. It really does impact
This
you.
was after the first motion that was passed in Senate.
This is after the arms and ammunition motion that was passed. And obviously I had conversations with the defense minister during that time, and I was told that, no, we hadn't sent any arms. When the minister tells you that we haven't in the last 5 years, you don't really have anything to fight with and say, no, you're lying to me.
They're not arms, they were components of the arms.
Components, exactly. And so whether it was the semantics of the way they were wording things, but I still didn't understand why we couldn't be transparent with the Australian people about it. Yes, there are security elements of it. Yes, there are intelligence matters, but you could, remove those components and at least be able to communicate to the Australian people.
Is it fair to say that doesn't matter whether it is Labour government or Liberal government, whoever is in the government, they have a deceptive communication to the Australian people?
I can't speak for the Liberal government, but we saw how they conducted themselves around the robo-debt scheme and how people had had died by suicide. And so I guess comparing both of them, a lot of people have told me that they see both the Labor Party and the Liberals as two sides of the same coin. There is no longer the discussion of, we're going to vote for the lesser of two evils, because you just can't.
And where do you see the political party that you launched? What is this the background for that? Because they are part of the same, or two sides of the same coin?
Yeah, so Australia's Voice came into conception after many conversations that I had with Australians, whether it was around the state of Western Australia or over East, where they were constantly saying, we feel that we don't have a voice. We don't have an avenue to have our voices heard. We don't feel like our voice matters. We feel disenfranchised by the two major party duopoly. And so when you hear that so often, you feel like you almost feel compelled that, yes, I'm an independent, but I need to provide Australians with an alternative choice. And that choice is now the Australia's Voice, where we will enact every policy in consultation, where we don't just pick things out of thin air and say, well, ta-da, whether this is practical or not, we're going to implement it. And sometimes, like we've seen, there's backtracking. There is, broken promises where you just don't deliver because you haven't struck a deal with the opposition. So for us, it's maintaining a position of principle where we are brave enough to do what Labor isn't doing, but more practical enough than what, for example, we've been hearing that the Greens sometimes go way too far and they're not practical and pragmatic enough. So there is a void in between that Australia's Voice will occupy and represent people as best as we can for all Australians. And it's so important that, those really, the real everyday issues are not lost in the translation of the two major parties politicking. And the conversations we've had so far, people are saying, I think that my Labor lower house member is doing a good job. And I say, you can still vote for them. But if you want to hold them to account in the upper house, in the Senate, you can vote for Australia's Voice. And that opportunity is provided to the Australian people so that when it comes to bills that they're not happy with, we've been bombarded by the mis and disinformation bill that's set to hit the Senate in the next fortnight. How do we make sure that Australians truly have a voice that is there for them, not for the big lobby groups, not for the big corporations, but for the Australians, the average worker who's just trying to put food on the table, feed his family, put a roof over their heads, make sure that their children have a chance in education and into the future that they didn't have. Exactly like a similar story to every Australian out there. Whether you're an immigrant or not, you've experienced this where you just want your politicians to listen to you.
Yeah. How much support does Australian Voice has at the moment since its launch? How many members do you have? And even last night I was going through your Facebook page and we click on the link and the website was not working and there were a few things. So what was the homework done properly? What sort of team do you have? And are there serious people, seasoned politicians or new politicians willing to join Australian Voice? So what is the status right now?
So Australia's Voice obviously being launched in October. Yes, it was, you could say that it was something that we needed to do really quickly, lodge the paperwork, make sure that the Australian Electoral Commission had the time to advertise to see if there was any objections to the creation of the party. So all that needed to be done, mindful of the ACT election, the Northern Territory election, the Queensland election, knowing that that would have impacted the AEC's operations. So for us, it was important to get the messaging out there, to get the fact that an alternative choice exists. Mind you, it started with just me and my husband and seeking advice from various people. And to fast forward now where it's at, we've wanted to do everything that is right by the people, by everyday Australians. So we didn't rush to just put, a website where it's not encrypted, where, we needed to ensure that the security and where the data of people were stored, that was safe. It wasn't something that we were just going to do on the fly. And bearing in mind that, running a minor party requires money and donations. And having all that infrastructure set up with just me and my husband and a few close friends meant that it was going to take time. There were going to be teething issues. But that wasn't going to stop us. Like, yes, this is the harder path. It would have been so much easier for me to just blend in the background and stay within the Labor Party and not represent my constituency with full liberty and autonomy. But now having that structure in place, having the basic infrastructure up and running, we've got about 2,000 people that have reached out around the country wanting to get involved in one form and capacity of helping out, whether it's as a volunteer, as a member. We've received expressions of interest from people who were previously in one of the major parties as a member or as a voter and wanting to get involved as a candidate and run as a candidate in their seat. There have been people from local councils and shires who have previously run or are current councillors and they're expressing interest.
And are these people from Galt communities or are
It's a mix.
It's a mix.
It's incredible. I mean, we were in Melbourne over the weekend and just the reception to see, predominantly older white men come to my meet and greet and ask questions and be curious and offer their support and help was so heartwarming. The media want to pigeonhole me as only serving the multicultural community or only serving Muslims, but I'm here for all Australians, regardless of what background they're from. If there's people out there who feel like the Labor Party or the Liberal Party don't represent them, and they want to see more progressive changes in terms of being bolder and more courageous in our national foreign policy space, or being more practical and pragmatic in our domestic issues, then that's what Australia's Voice is there for.
So when the Australians elected you as the senator, they primarily voted for the Labour Party. So I was looking at the number of votes. So there were around 500,000 votes that were for the Labour Party, and there were 1,400 votes that were from your circle or following. So is it fair to the Labour Party that you become a senator based on their following, and after that you part ways with them and launch your own party because you gain traction and following because of their vote? So is it fair to them?
You should ask them the question of why they didn't stick to their true values of being a party for the people that elected them. You know, when I joined the Labor Party and I campaigned so hard for both state and federal elections to ensure that we continued having a progressive, visionary, brave government, and they just didn't live up to it. So I feel like the Labor Party has left their voter base behind. They've left their members behind. We've seen the wars they're having with the union movement, with workers out there and leaving them out to dry. The Labor Party has definitely lost its way. And I would love for you to put this question to them and see how they would come back, because the number 3 Senate spot was unwinnable. It wasn't like they gave me a safe seat and said, oh, you know, you took advantage of our safe seat. I did not take advantage of any safe seat. In fact, I tried really hard. I worked 9 months straight on ensuring that the Labor Party changed its trajectory on the way they were handling what's happening in Palestine and speaking out against the genocide. For them to completely ignore me indicated that they were happy for me to exist there and look pretty in their photos, but not for me to have my own individual voice. Because the moment I started sounding different to them, that's when they started cutting me loose. And there was double standards. We had, you know, other members from the other factions within the Labor Party make statements and say things, and they did not receive the same repercussions. Whereas the moment I spoke out and called it a genocide, you know, there was immediate repercussions. There were immediate consequences. And when asked why the same standard was not applied to those people within our caucus that were pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian, I was told that in the left faction, we hold ourselves to a high standard. So we don't care what people in the right do. I think that's very disingenuous, and that is something that people need to hear.
Don't you think that's a common problem in the entire Western world, whether it is Australia or US or UK?
Australia takes pride in itself as the world's most successful multicultural nation. We need to live up to that. That can't just be like confetti thrown around only when it serves us. I can't speak for the US, I can't speak for France, but what I can speak for is Australia doing better, because I know that we can do better. It's ensuring that things like Islamophobia is not normalized. You know, we've heard from the Islamophobia Register that Islamophobic rhetoric and anti-Palestinian rhetoric has increased almost by 1,000%. But why is the community so complacent in just brushing it under a rug, not reporting it, not complaining about it, not making a big issue? And that comes from our peak bodies all the way to individuals who experience racism, discrimination, and Islamophobia on a local level.
So we are running short of time. I would move on to the last question. So you said that the community is not vocal in a lot of issues that they are facing with respect to Islamophobia and being marginalized in some cases. So you were there at the IFAM convention in Sydney, and you shared your thoughts, which were very well received. So what is it that Muslim organizations need to do, and what role they are currently playing, and what should they do more?
I think my key message to all organizations out there is do not confuse access with influence. Just because you may have access to a politician, it could be the Prime Minister. Just because you've got access to the Prime Minister does not mean you have influence. And how do you make sure that you've got influence? It's when your community's demands and asks are respected and delivered. And if that does not happen, then you know where you sit. Because for far too long, we have thought just because we can get politicians to our events, that they must definitely listen to us. Just because we accept checks and donations and grants from politicians, that they must really listen and care for us. We've seen in the last 12 months that they don't. Not a single organization has fully seen the $25 million that was given under the social cohesion banner to pro-Palestinian or the Islamic community. Why? Where is the outrage? Where is people standing up and saying there is a double standard here and we need to call it out? And I think these peak bodies need to focus on, firstly, becoming politically engaged. Now, politically engaged doesn't, again, mean invite politicians to your events, rub shoulders, take photos, and call it a day. It means ensuring that when there are pieces of legislation that comes out, that you demand a consultation. If those politicians are not coming to you, you go to them. And if they then come out and say, well, nobody raised issues with us, combat that. Do not be passive. Another thing that organizations or peak bodies can do is empower their community, educate them about their civic duties, what it means to be politically engaged, what it means to think about policies that will impact your life, your future children's lives, your grandchildren's life. This doesn't just stop with us. I think sometimes we live in silos where we think, as long as it doesn't impact me, I shouldn't care about it. But what happened to the collective mentality? What happened to the ummatic mentality that we need to have inherently as Muslims, but seeing broader than that as a broader community? As Australians, we need to want what's best for our mate next door. And finally, it's putting our money where our mouth is, right? We are excellent when it comes to donating to charities. Why do we not have a donation that goes to a political trust, for example, where we ensure that we upskill candidates, whether it's local government, state government, or for federal parliament? Why do we not have media training for those candidates? Why are we not thinking outside the box and putting money and research into building infrastructures, building research hubs, building think tanks, lobbying groups, and understanding that, there is more to politics than just writing an email to your local MP or putting up a post on social media? That definitely helps, and it goes a long way, because everyone, the whole Australian community and worldwide, have indicated that we were able to break the Israeli government's propaganda through social media. Whether that was through TikTok or Instagram, the things we shared, the authentic, unfiltered, unbiased content from the ground on Gaza that we were able to see. That does not just come because there's a few journalists on the ground reporting. That comes as a collective movement. And so these peak bodies need to be promoting those initiatives, not just thinking, okay, how do I secure another $5 million for my organization so that I can continue holding the status as CEO or whatever. It needs to be, let's share a vision, come together as a peak, an alliance of peak bodies. Let's think about what is our main goal. And there can be various ways we get to our main goal, but at least we've got a shared main goal.
Thank you so much, Senator. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was a pleasure talking to you.
No, my pleasure.